You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, this is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of SLA Insights. I'm continuing a discussion of language output and how it contributes to the language acquisition process. Last week, I talked about how output provides a diagnostic tool for learners. This week, I want to take the time to look at how it also provides a diagnostic tool for instructors. And to do that, I'm again using this diagram from Rod Ellis, where the SLA process begins with input. The learner receives input, and that input, as the learner derives intake, it goes into the learner's brain where we can't see what's going on, and they begin to accommodate and restructure their interlanguage system or their understanding of the language, and they're starting to acquire what the new language. Now notice inside this box, we cannot observe what's going on. The learner himself or herself cannot observe what is going on. It's not until the learner produces output here on the other side that we really get a sense of what has been acquired and what has not been acquired. And so this is where it becomes a diagnostic tool. So just as the learner can know what he or she knows or doesn't know when they get to the point of producing output, so anyone outside of the learner, like an instructor, will also know or learn what the student has or has not learned. So there's some diagnostic implications here when we're looking at output. So for learners, last week we talked about noticing, reflecting, and testing hypotheses, that this is all part of the diagnostic process, that once a learner produces output, he or she can use that to further develop the language learning, to recognize where there are gaps and so on. It's going to be very similar for an instructor, but I wanted to spend a little more time here to talk about what an instructor might do next to help their student once they've gotten through that diagnostic process. So for the instructor, the big thing is going to be noticing. Where are the gaps? What does the learner know or not know? So when a learner produces a sentence and says, for example, I want hamburger, and you say, oh, they've missed the definite article. We're going to have to go back and make sure they understand that. And so that's a part of this process in diagnostics, and knowing what the learner has or has not fully acquired or accommodated in their developing system. So how do I use this? If I'm the instructor, once I've noticed what the learner knows or doesn't know, once I've made the diagnosis, then what next? Well, there are several steps to the process, and I'm going to highlight two here. The first is going to be feedback. Now, if the learner knows what you want them to know and what you expect them to know, then it's going to be positive feedback. Good job. Or you just continue the conversation without any interruptions because you're communicating. You're able to continue with what you're saying. So on the positive side, if you know, you just keep doing what you're doing. But on the negative side, if there's a mistake that's been made, if there's a gap in the language that comes out as a result of the student producing output, say missing the definite article, that's when you have the opportunity to give negative feedback or what's called corrective feedback. And that's going to be a whole episode in and of itself, but that'll be coming up for the next episode. We'll talk about negative feedback. But then once you've given that feedback, then it goes to planning. What do I need to review? What do I need to reteach? What do I need to reinforce? What is the learner ready to do next? So if it's positive, if they know what is being said, they're able to produce it and produce it without problem, then it's okay. What's the next step in the language learning process. Where do I take them next? And that enters into the whole issue of syllabus structure and design of a course, which I'm not going to deal with today. But the other thing is, if it's negative, if they're missing something, if they don't have what you want them to have at this point, if they're not able to produce, if there's evidence that they've not acquired it, well, then you need to go back and review, reteach, reinforce. And so the first thing that comes to mind, at least in my mind, and I'm sure for many of us, it's, oh, well, I need to go back and reteach the rules. Oh, I need to go back and drill them some more on this topic. That's one option. But perhaps they need more input. And so if you look at this chart here, they're receiving negative feedback from you. You recognize that their output is not correct. What if you brought it back around to input? The chances are they need more work with the input to start the process again, or to reinforce the process for the language acquisition, from the language acquisition side of things. So yes, correction, yes, reviewing, reteaching, but I would encourage you to do it in the form of more input, providing more opportunities to deal with that particular form, that particular vocabulary in the context of input-based activities. So, to bring things to a close today, output is going to provide the instructor with a diagnostic tool to know what has in fact been acquired by the learner. There's so much going on in the brain that we don't know and we can't observe, that we don't know until they produce the output, whether they know it or not, or how well they know it. So with these diagnostic tools, the teacher can then go back and reinforce or help the student out to know what they need next. Do they need review, or are they ready to move on to the next form or structure? So in the next episode, I'm going to cover in much more detail negative feedback and how in the language learning process, after a learner has produced output, there's going to be a period of feedback from the instructor, especially if there are errors to be corrected. And error correction is a whole set of research in and of itself within SLA in terms of how do you give feedback. And so we're going to talk about that in the next episode. I hope you can join me. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.